There were lots of mineral specimens in Dr. Francati's display case, and they were all described in dry, scientific terms that were probably of interest to geology majors, but not Virgil. All except one. It sat in the back of the case, a Dodger blue transparent color in a configuration that, according to the labels for other similarly shaped specimens in the case, was called a candle. He had to look at the other mineral specimens to guess at what it was, because this one was unlabeled. Was it a new specimen that Dr. Francati hadn't got around to labeling? Virgil hadn't remembered seeing it there before, but then again he didn't normally pay attention to what was in the case. But something about this one, he guessed some trick of the light had made it seem to flicker for a moment, almost like the crystal was trying to wave at him. Silly, really. Mineral specimens didn't think, much less try to get people's attention, unless you were one of those New Age tree huggers or old-fashioned humpa-humpa natives. He leaned on the case, trying to get a better look at it. Oh, who was he kidding? He wanted to touch it, though it seemed corny to admit it even to himself. He was no rockhound, and he sucked at the natural sciences, but he glanced around. A few professors down at the end of the hall, a cluster of students chatting with each other in the other direction, and a couple of students walking down the hall talking to each other. He waited for the couple to pass, then slipped around to the back side where the doors were and pulled on the handle. Of course it was locked. He should have known that, since some of the specimens in the case could cost a pretty penny. In fact, it was completely out of character for him to steal anything, especially something as useless as a mineral specimen. Footsteps were approaching, the measured tread of a professor in dress shoes, not the shuffle of a student in sneakers. Oh crap! He sank to his knees and unslung his backpack, ready to grope around in pretend search of a lost pencil if said professor asked what he was doing behind the case. A shadow fell over the part of him that wasn't already shadowed by the display case. Has one of my mineral specimens escaped its case? Oh crap, it was Dr. Asimov of all professors. I dropped a pencil. He swept a hand around the floor near him. Ah, it was your pencil that was the escape artist. Rather improbable that it rolled back here, don't you think? He smiled, amused by the cliched excuse. Busted. He almost confessed, but then... More improbable than a specimen getting out of a locked case? Dr. Asimov chuckled. I admit that's rather improbable, but then I have a rather improbable specimen in the case right now. He rested an arm on the case and leaned on it. Do you know which one I'm talking about? Virgil looked at him in confusion, then noticed the doctor was holding a ring of keys. Hope surged in Virgil. He didn't understand why he was suddenly so obsessed with that crystal, but he'd get at it any way he could. The blue candle that doesn't have a label? The doctor looked at him, then put the keyring in his pocket. He was suddenly a lot less amused than he had been a few seconds ago. I don't believe I've had you since general science. Vincent, is it? Virgil. He shifted uncomfortably. And, no, I don't have any natural science classes in my track. Normally I don't either, but Dr. Francati had a family emergency and I've been picking up some of his classes. My act of generosity seems to have been a more momentous event than I realized. The comment was lost on Virgil. All he could glean from it was that it didn't sound like the beginning of a lecture about petty theft. What's that got to do with me? Dr. Asimov sighed and put his now empty hand on Virgil's shoulder. Virgil, we need to talk. He started to guide Virgil down the hall. And here he thought Dr. Asimov was going to let him. But I've got to get to Professor Mickelson's. No, you don't. I'll talk to him. Dr. Asimov ushered him down the short length of hall to the physics lab where his office was. You and I need to talk. Virgil glanced worriedly at Dr. Asimov several times, wondering what sort of punishment he was in for, especially since he didn't technically do anything. Dr. Asimov didn't say anything until they had gone through the room to his office, where he closed the door. Dr. Asimov leaned against his desk and crossed his arms. Tell me why you said that blue candle was my improbable specimen, and why you were so determined to get into the case. Well, now that he was away from the case, it was already sounding corny to himself just thinking about it. How could he tell Dr. Asimov that he really, really needed to touch that one particular stone? I never saw anything like it before, and if I knew there was stuff like that in geology, I might have picked a different major, he babbled. Dr. Asimov watched him for a moment, his expression stern. You haven't answered my question. Why do you think that one was my improbable specimen? Virgil squirmed under the gaze, shuffled his feet, stared at his toes, looked at the walls on both sides of Dr. Asimov, went back to staring at his toes. Finally, he lifted his head and said, because once I saw that one, I couldn't walk past it. He hesitantly looked at Dr. Asimov, expecting a scolding or patronizing comment. When Dr. Asimov remained silent, he tentatively added, usually I don't notice what's in the case. Even now I can only tell you what's near the blue candle and what I compared it to trying to learn what it was. So it's pretty improbable that I looked at what was in the case long enough to find something to call it because it didn't have a card. Dr. Asimov stood up and moved closer to Virgil, looked him in the eyes and made sure Virgil was looking in his. Tell me honestly, were you thinking of breaking into the case? Under the intensity of Dr. Asimov's gaze, Virgil nearly froze, his previous squirming reduced to a rapidly changing sequence of facial expressions, ending with a grimace. Yes. Because you had to touch the stone? Yes. Because it was calling you? Yes. Virgil blinked in shock when he realized what he'd just admitted to. He waited for the gotcha of answering a ridiculous question, or some get your head out of you-know-where and start paying attention to reality lecture. But Dr. Asimov was suddenly silent. He took his glasses off and rubbed his forehead. After a long sigh, he put them back on and looked at Virgil. His expression was still serious, but also slightly sad. Virgil, do you know why we're here? We're in here? Something had changed after that challenge, but Virgil was at a loss for what? No. The easy answer is that you'd never hear the end of it if anyone heard you giving an answer like that, and I'd be laughed right out of academia for accepting such an answer. The real answer is that you had no idea what you'd be getting into if you'd opened that case. What I'd be getting into? Virgil wondered aloud. What was so odd about the case that he'd have no idea about what would happen if he'd opened it? Belatedly, he realized what else Dr. Asimov had said, that he'd be laughed out of academia for accepting Virgil's claim that the stone had called him. His eyes widened when he made the connection. Is there something about the stone? Could there be some weird radiation? He suddenly remembered a sort of hypnosis people claim some really big waterfalls had. Could some crystals do the same thing? Something dangerous? Dangerous? Dr. Asimov half closed his eyes for a moment, thoughtful. Not in the way you're probably thinking, but danger will find you if you choose to enter in a relationship with her. Her? Dr. Asimov was assigning gender to rocks? And Virgil had been worried about admitting a rock had called him. Rocks have sex? Dr. Asimov unbuttoned enough of his shirt to pull out a macrame necklace. Though the cording looked primitive, the knotwork itself was as elaborate and fine as what would have come from a Parisian goldsmith. I admit, I'm making an educated guess. He popped a dark purplish blue stone about the diameter of a toilet paper roll out of a knotwork bezel and set it on his desk. I just know the indigo Heartstone is definitely female. The stone was flat, slightly ovoid, faceted around the edge, and would have been perfectly clear except for the deep crack running through one end of it. Virgil started to roll his eyes, then froze, staring in shock as the flat stone grew taller and seemed to sprout, transforming before his eyes into a twin of the stone in the display case. I met her when I was about your age. We've had a bond ever since, and through that bond I can tell you she is definitely female. If a rock could change shape then at room temperature with no apparent forces acting on it, Virgil was willing to accept it could have a discernible sex. It's called Heartstone? How common are they? He reached toward the stone tentatively, then paused and glanced uncertainly at Dr. Asimov. If Dr. Asimov didn't want him touching the one in the case, She won't do anything to you. She's bonded to me, and she probably knows Blue Heartstone wants you." He smiled. "But be careful, she's a bit fragile." Virgil gently laid a finger on the main point, which wobbled slightly under his touch. A slight, almost electric-like current traveled partway up his forearm. "Sorry," he told the crystal, and genuinely was. He let go of the main point and instead rubbed the smaller points surrounding it. A milder sensation came to the finger he was stroking it with, and he got the impression that his apology was accepted. He was undeniably communicating with the crystal somehow. What can she do? Dr. Asimov had remained close, getting a bit tense when the point wobbled, and then relaxing again when the crystal accepted Virgil's apology. "The ancient tales of the Inkata say that godlike beings called Lightbringers created Heartstones to fend off a storm of evil that threatens Earthea every 26,000 years or so. When the evil emerges, the Heartstones awaken and empower Ichikot to battle them." "What's an Ichikot?" Dr. Asimov shook his head. "The term doesn't translate very well. I could say warrior, companion, slave, partner, engine. There's a lot of words I could use. All would be at least partially true, but none would be entirely true.